Let's get to it. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for Press Freedom Frontlines. Very much looking forward to hearing from our speakers today. My name is Mike Larsen, and I am a faculty member and co-chair of the Criminology Department at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And I'm also the current president of the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, or BC FIPA. FIPA has organized this event with the generous hosting support of the KPU Criminology Department. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge that from my KPU role, that we work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katsi, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikit, and Coquitlam peoples. And this acknowledgement serves as a reminder of our ongoing commitment to truth and reconciliation. In my FIPA role as an organization that spans BC and indeed extends across Canada, I want to acknowledge that much of FIPA's work takes place on the unceded and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, something that we always bear in mind, particularly as the issues that we work on, information and privacy rights, are areas that have deleteriously impacted Indigenous communities in Canada for a long time, and something we're committed to seeking to redress in our work. Thank you again for being here for Press Freedom Frontlines. So I want to begin briefly by talking about who we are as FIPA. Freedom of Information and Privacy Association is a nonprofit organization in British Columbia, a society that's dedicated to protecting and extending information and privacy rights in BC and across Canada. We work on a whole wide range of issues, and a lot of these issues intersect, as you might imagine, with broader issues around transparency and, of course, with press freedom. The right to know is intimately intertwined with matters of press freedom, and so it's no surprise to me that the FIPA over the years has done a lot of work with journalists and media organizations that are seeking both access to information and also to defend journalistic rights. And that brings me to this last fall of 2021, in which we as an organization, and I think the broader civil liberties and information rights communities in Canada, became aware of a small but very ardent and active and engaged and principled campaign around the Student Press Freedom Act. And our speakers today, Spencer Izen and Jessica Kim, who I'm again very grateful for joining us, are the driving forces behind that act and have really made a splash in terms of putting student press freedom front and center on the table of a number of organizations like ours, as well as on the table of the Premier and a number of provincial politicians and organizations seeking to push back against censorship and restriction of their own access to information rights as journalists. So without further ado from me, I will welcome our guests, Spencer Izen and Jessica Kim, who are student journalists with the Griffins Nest newspaper, and again, the driving force behind the Student Press Freedom Act campaign. We'll turn the floor over to them, and we'll have some time as we move forward for questions and discussion. So if anything comes to mind, you can start putting stuff in the chat, and we'll get to that then, but we'll also open things up for some conversation as we go forward. Spencer and Jessica, over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Mike. And thank you again to BC FIPA and the KPU Criminology Department for having us today. I'm really excited to share a bit about our journey and what press freedom could look like in BC schools. So next slide, please.
We would also first like to acknowledge that we live, learn, work, and report from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And just moving on to the next slide to introduce ourselves.
I'll go. So I'm the editor-in-chief from 2020 to 2022 of the Griffins Nest.
And I'm the managing editor. So the Griffins Nest is our student newspaper operating out of Eric Hamber Secondary School. And of course, together, we're the campaign directors and co-drafters of the Student Press Freedom Act campaign.
Next slide, please. So really our story in a sentence, it's a very, very vast oversimplification of it, but our experiences as student journalists have pushed us to take action, advocate for new, original legislative solutions to really deal with the heart of the unacceptable state of press freedom in BC schools. And that's, I think, the main point that we want to get across today. Next slide, please.
So we've kind of broken things down into 3 periods just to be able to discuss and digest today. So part 1, we would say, is around December 2020 to May 2021. So December 2020 was our first censorship incident as an editorial board of our paper. And then the point of action, which was in June 2021, which is where the Student Press Freedom Act came to be. And then part 2, which is moving into the fall of this year with another volume of our paper and the challenges we experienced there.
Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. So a bit more about part 1 and the first phase of how we got into working with press freedom issues. As we took the helm of our paper with 3 other editors last year, we kind of had two major types of infringement on our press freedom. And so the first and second time that happened is our school administrators involved themselves in editorial decisions that should be made by students, but were unreasonably taken away from us. Or attempted to be taken away from us. And the first time that happened is when we wrote an article in December 2020, as Jessica first mentioned, about how there was some misinformation spreading in our school community. There was QAnon circulating in school group chats, and we wanted to use our newspaper as a platform to say, don't follow QAnon, it's a conspiracy theory, and it should not be, please do not believe it. And surprisingly, there was an issue with that because an administrator felt at the time that describing QAnon as a conspiracy theory could upset some parents who potentially believed in it. And we didn't think that was an appropriate way to involve themselves in our content and our journalism. Obviously, QAnon is a conspiracy theory, and we stood our ground in that discussion. It happens again a few months later at the beginning of 2021 when we wrote an editorial that was critical of the way in which our school district organized the academic planning around that particular school year. And when we had presented that to administrators for a customary preview, they took issue with it because they felt that it could stir up trouble, and it was too harsh on public figures who had worked hard on the quarter system that so many people had negative impressions of. But really, where it culminated was last year at the end, in May of 2021, when we sent a request for comments to our school district, and they sent it back to our school with the instruction to control the narrative of our article. And I think I'll let Jessica talk a bit more in the next slide about how we transform that into something very, very different. Next slide, please.
And so, although in all of these 3 instances from last year, we were able to eventually publish, and we were able to, disseminate our content without any changes, any altercations, despite the challenges we overcame. We weren't just satisfied with that being the end of it. The biggest question that kind of kept coming up in our discussions just with each other were, well, what is there to say this won't happen again next year? And if it's happening here, what about other schools? And so that's when we took the step to look at creating press protection legislation, the Student Press Freedom Act for BC.
And so we spent the last summer, sorry, next slide, please. There we go. That's it. So we spent last summer really organizing the initial phases of the act. We started reaching out to different groups, asking for endorsement. We worked with a lot of generous lawyers who kindly gave us their advice and time to make sure the act was something that could work, and it wasn't just a piece of paper drafted by 2 high schoolers. And after the summer, we returned to school. And what we also returned to was a new set of challenges and why this is so significant, and I think particularly to our discussion today, is that all of these incidents that occurred over this year have really shown us that why exactly we need the legislation that we're proposing. And we've gone through things, lengthy issues with freedom of information, and some of them are the issues that are shared by professional media and like that file freedom of information requests. like as FIPA says, access delayed is access denied. We still experience a lot of the delays with filing FOIs that has diminishing returns for using that. But we also have some unique experiences with freedom of information requests that don't particularly occur as much. Like having our authority to file them even questioned. That has come up before, and we've been told to prove that we have the ability to even submit a request. We've also had the confidentiality of those FOIs breached, and that has had negative effects on our publication, because school officials have come down saying, we saw your FOI, what's that about, and come down to talk about that with us. And just in the realm of freedom of information, because that's been a significant point of a lot of our issues this year. Jessica and I did make a submission to the committee to review the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act earlier this year, and we were very pleased to see that they took 2 of our 3 recommendations, including a legislated right to anonymity with an FOI. So our challenges have evolved the campaign. And demonstrated a lot of the nuances that we didn't get to experience last year. But what they have shown us is that there's so many facets to press freedom violations that it's very difficult to really write an act and then look at it 6 months later and keep it the same thing, and knowing what having experienced it. Other things we've experienced are having our investigations obstructed, again through school officials coming down and trying to insert themselves in the process. We've been denied access to public meetings before that were literally labeled public sessions, and ourselves and the TIE were not able to access them. We've experienced administrative procedures that were passed that were very threatening towards student journalism. Thankfully, the Canadian Association of Journalists and British Columbia Civil Liberties Association jointly issued a statement condemning the policies and along with the Student Press Law Center in the United States, coming to the aid of the Griffins Nest. And just recently, as of earlier this month, a school trustee threatened us with defamation if we, after we asked her about some comments she made in a board meeting, and she signed off an email with, "I trust the Griffins Nest will not publish anything defamatory." And all of these things really suggest to us that that unless legislation like what we're proposing comes into effect, student journalists are still going to be subject to all sorts of issues like we've listed here, and probably ones that we haven't experienced and that we haven't predicted, but they need to be deterred through provincial legislation. And I think that's the second part of what we want to talk about, and really what that looks like. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so here you can see we have the draft of the act. Born in June 2021. That version that existed back then was rather shaky. And one thing that Spencer did mention was that the experiences of ourselves throughout these past 2 years, as well as the experiences we've learned of other student journalists, have really helped us, fine tune the act with the help of lawyers, and explore press freedom and all the ways in which it can be obstructed, even the more nuanced ways.
Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. But one of the first questions that we always get asked about this and why we're doing this in the first place is, why do we actually need it? And aside from the actual experiences that we've listed, the common assumption is that, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms should just apply, and someone needs to remind the school officials of that. But what we found is there's 2 big reasons why that's not really the simple solution. And the first one is we don't really know the extent to which the Charter applies to Canadian public schools. Unlike the United States, we don't have a case like Tinker or Hazelwood, and these big Supreme Court standards to really rely on to tell us what protections we are afforded. We can only really speculate based on some other judgments that are in analogous situations, but not quite related to press freedom and not freedom of expression in schools. So very, very basically, the law isn't there because we don't know what it looks like right now. And we need something to clarify that law in a very concise way, like legislation.
And moving into the second reason is really, if you've ever been in a school, the practical circumstances really restrict a student's ability to assert their rights. Because of the hierarchy and because of the overreaching authority that administration and even school staff do have over students, it's simply not just as easy as saying, you know, well, the charter applies without any a case law or anything like that set really in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. But moving into what the Act does and what we're proposing, we would say it does mainly 4 things. And so the first one is it simply says that students enjoy rights to freedom of expression and freedom of the press. The second thing is it protects confidential sources of student journalists, which is something we saw professional journalists get in 2017 through the Journalistic Sources Protection Act. Because that act defines journalism and in a way that doesn't include student journalists, it has to be included in the SPFA. And we think that's a really valuable element because while we haven't experienced it, we know that there are other student publications that have come to us saying, you know, our principals or our vice principals would like to know our sources for this, and that's very inappropriate and that's very wrong, which is why they need to be protected under the SPFA. The third thing it does is it acts as a shield for retribution against students who are writing articles and reporting, teachers who are either teaching them or sponsoring their club, and principals who don't want to, who are being ordered by higher levels of a school district to interfere but won't. Really, what it said, what the retribution part is about, is it says that no one can be punished for either exercising their rights if they're a student, or if they're allowing a student to exercise their rights, they can't be disciplined for having that go on. So if you write an article that's critical of the school, the student should not be in detention, nor should the teacher be reassigned magically. That would be prohibited by the SPFA. And then the fourth thing it does is it provides a forum for access to justice through an appeals mechanism that ensures that there's some administrative fairness in the process of, if we do need to take a closer look at an article or some content, that there's a process to do so, and that you can appeal to a higher level for that one. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so another question we often get asked is, what is student media? The Act protects student media, but what is that? Mm-hmm. So student media would be any journalistic content that's made for the purposes of dissemination. And obviously, this Act applies to all BC public schools. So some examples, obviously, of student media, we talk a lot about newspapers. That's where our experience comes in, but also yearbooks, podcasts, magazines, anything similar. And we know one of the most common forms of censorship in schools is actually in yearbooks, with grad quotes that students submit, very, very often subject to arbitrary limits.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. But another part about our campaign is it isn't just us saying we need this act. We've also been joined by a lot of fantastic organizations that have said that with us. And those include the Canadian Association of Journalists, BC FIPA, the Canadian University Press, the Student Press Law Center in the United States, the Canadian Institute for Information and Privacy Studies, the Center for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University, the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic at the University of Ottawa, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association have all stood up and said, it's time that we recognize the rights of student journalists through specific legislation designed to help them like this. Next slide, please.
And so it's not just them either. Obviously, this act isn't just to protect the Griffins Nest. It's to protect students in all BC public schools. So over the course of the past 2 years, we've been really, really lucky to meet incredible student journalists who are trying their best to do important work to their communities, and they are. But more often than not, they're met with restrictions and limitations and things that would be solved with the help of legislation, with the help of the SPFA. Mm-hmm. Next slide.
So what we've got over here as well is all of the nameplates of the student media organizations that have endorsed the SPFA, and they're from all across the Lower Mainland in the province. But one important thing to recognize about the group of students represented here is it isn't a full picture, and what it doesn't show is the several student media organizations that felt they couldn't put their name to it, just because that in and of itself was too big of a risk for them. And I think that really goes to show that the state of press freedom and freedom of expression in BC schools is so dire that some students don't even feel that they can actually publicly even support the concept of that without retribution.
And we know that even some of the names on this list have been subject to retribution for even associating themselves with an act like this.
So some of these students, or some of the publications listed here, took a great risk in coming aboard, and we're very appreciative of that. And we're also appreciative of the ones that were still uncomfortable with signing and committing themselves to this. And I think that only goes to speak further to why we need the act. Next slide, please.
I think the most important takeaway that Spencer and I have certainly learned over the course of our tenures as editors of the paper, and also as campaign directors, and also of just speaking with all these other student journalists from across the province, is student journalists are real journalists, and they really do deserve to be treated and protected as such.
Next slide, please. So this would conclude our presentation part of our event today, and you can see our website and our Twitter and Instagram there. And we'd be very happy to move on to some questions and getting into a discussion about really what our vision for student media is, and more about all of our experiences thus far. But thank you.
So there we go. I think it was a really interesting event. I'm consistently impressed with the energy and the understanding of the entire advocacy process that Jessica and Spencer bring to the Student Press Freedom Act campaign. What followed after the presentation was a great discussion period. We got into some of the ideas about how to push for law reform, the different avenues that could be approached, different institutions and bodies that could be subject to complaints or investigations, angles for advocacy and pressure on governments to bring legislation into action and put it on the table. We talked a little bit about some of the challenges faced by student journalists, in particular filing FOI requests, barriers imposed by fees, of course, delays, as well as the fee estimates that often come with those kinds of requests. We got into some of the nuances of their experiences as being simultaneously students and reporters working in, and journalists working in institutions that they're reporting on, that precarious dual role position that really presents particular challenges and gives rise to the call for some specific protection in legislation. I think it was a really interesting conversation. I know I enjoyed listening and taking part in it. And it's the kind of conversation that we often conclude FIPA events with. So if you're interested in these kinds of issues, press freedom, transparency, access to information, and indeed access to justice, I really invite you to continue to follow FIPA, become involved in the kind of work that we do, and through your involvement, we can continue to support organizations that are also pushing for change in this very important field. Again, on behalf of FIPA, I'm Mike Larsen, current president, and I want to thank Jessica and Spencer of the Griffins Nest newspaper for the time they took to be with us today. Thanks.
The BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association is an organization whose mission is to improve and defend privacy and transparency as vital components of a free and democratic society. We envision public agencies who are transparent in action and decision, people in control of their privacy and personal information, and privacy and transparency embedded in law and policy. We're one of Canada's few advocacy groups dedicated to access to information and transparency and privacy issues. We conduct research into the public opinion, policy, and law that intersect access to information and privacy frameworks in BC and across Canada. And this includes monitoring the performance of public bodies, governments, and regulators in the sector. FIPA commissions studies and provides material that empower lawyers, journalists, students, and the public. In turn, we are frequently consulted on policy issues by politicians and government officials. FIPA's work encompasses legal research, public legal education, public assistance and aid, and law reform that focuses on transparency and privacy issues. If you're interested in these issues and you'd like to learn more, or if you'd like to contribute to FIPA as a donor or become a member of the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, I encourage you to visit our website at fipa.bc.ca. You'll also find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Thanks very much.